Persuading people to take the actions we want can be hard. Our teams and clients are bombarded with thousands of messages every single day. But there is a way for you to get above the noise. Stories. This is the Stories with Traction podcast, and I'm your host, Matt Zaun. Join my guests and me as we unpack the power of storytelling. We'll talk about topics like leadership, sales, and marketing, all through the lens of strategic storytelling. Enjoy this episode. September of last year, I was speaking in Georgia, and there was an individual in my session that shared some stories that blew me away. I had to have her on so these stories could be shared with you as well. Today, I'm joined by Stephanie Crowe, who is the CEO of Learn.net. In addition, she's a best-selling author and speaker. Welcome to the show, Stephanie.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
I appreciate your time. I know you're extremely busy, so I really appreciate you spending some time with us today. I want to dive right into the story. One of the stories that you shared with me back in September, I can't believe it's been half a year now, but I remember elements of this story. It was such an engaging story. So can you just give, and through the story you will, but give people a little bit about your background and dive right into the story regarding your father?
Sure, absolutely. Growing up, we definitely had what we needed, but we didn't always have what we wanted. I'm sure there's a lot of folks in the audience who've had this experience. And I didn't really realize what it took for us to really achieve what we achieved as a family. But looking back, I heard a lot of our stories from growing up. So turns out, on his way back from East Asia, serving in East Asia, my father came back to have a family, two young girls, and quite frankly, they're having trouble making ends meet. So he ended up having three jobs. And each month, what I heard later, one of the stories, my mom and dad would get together and pull out the big popcorn bowl, throw all the bills into that bowl, and close their eyes and pick out which one actually could get paid off that month, right? So that's how close things were while we were growing up. That third job was probably the worst one, I'm sure. Dad would go into one of the local office complexes, and he was working as a janitor in this office complex, and that would be third shift, right? Overnight, clean up the office. And one day, when he was putting away the mops and the materials and such, he saw a job posting. And it said, if you can type 35 words a minute, we'll hire you. And this company was not just any company, it was IBM. This was a great opportunity. He could get hired into the data center. And this was the early 70s. I mean, it was tough to find tech talent at all in the 70s. And quite frankly, this is Vermont, Burlington, Vermont. So not a hotbed of tech talent there either. So here he's thinking, all I've got to do is figure out how to type 35 words a minute. And he was dedicated, and he was ready to teach himself this skill. But what you don't know about my dad is that he grew up in the backwoods of Maine. And we're talking single room shack, 5-person family, like a single light bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling kind of thing. They had to pump their own water. They chopped their own wood for heat. And one day when they were younger, my dad's brother and he were chopping wood, and his brother missed. And I gotta tell you, since that day, my dad's only had 9 fingers. He's missing his index finger on his left hand. So fast forward to the point where he's going to figure out how to type 35 words a minute. And he types with his 2 middle fingers, right? I mean, hut and peck, hut and peck, hut and peck. But I got to tell you, Matt, he did it. He figured it out. He learned that skill. He taught himself how to type 35 words a minute, and he got that job. Fast forward from there, and he ended up learning network telecommunication skills. He became a network telecommunication analyst, and then a project manager, and eventually a sales engineer and a program manager, and had a very long, successful career with IBM. And that really changed the trajectory of our family's fortunes also from that point forward. I'm the first
Wow.
person in my family to get my college degree. My sister and I both have degrees. I have a graduate degree, and this really taught me about learning forward and how people in their careers need the opportunity to learn into new skills to grow their careers. But that's also why I went into the learning industry. I believe when I look back and say, I believe so much that learning makes the difference for people.
Sure. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That is unbelievable. Incredible. I love that you mentioned the popcorn bowl with the different bills. I mean, I'm sure that was not a fun game for your parents to play.
Hey, you know what? Make it
Oh,
fun.
yeah, for sure, for sure. You got to gamify it, right? But it also speaks to the grit that you had in your family, right?
Mm.
Seeing that displayed for you probably led you in a direction to absorb more in your life, to be more resilient, to have that grit. So, as you kind of look back on that experience, I guess your early childhood experience, what can you say now, being an adult, when it comes to grit? Because clearly you didn't have everything under the sun when you were growing up. There was a lot of adversity based on the experience you shared. So how do you think that that molded you from a grit perspective into the leadership position you have today?
It surprises me when I hear from other people that they did not have the same experience I had, which is no one ever told me I couldn't do something. They never said, oh, you can't be because you're female, or because you're from somewhere, or because of your experience, or because of, what your lack of experience. It was always, if you want something, go learn it. And so in my mind, the sky was the limit. Anything I wanted, I just had to set my mind to and be willing to do the work. So I
Sure.
do think there's grit. I think there's also a belief system that says, don't let it stop you. Figure it out. Go find what you need. Get what you need to get, whether it's learning, education, that sort of thing, to get where you're going. I think that's been a really big part of that grit of achievement. And I mean, I experienced it all through growing up, which was I got validation from my teachers when I worked hard. And then I almost became addicted to that validation
Sure.
that right to keep trying that and to keep doing well. And whatever you set your mind to, be the best at it.
So it really speaks to an element of focus, right? So clearly you were focused. You weren't saying, "Hey, I can't do this because of X, Y, and Z." But there are a lot of people listening to this that may be experiencing that. They may have these seeds of doubt. They may be thinking about maybe about past experiences and having anxiety for the future based on certain things. So what would you say to someone from a focus perspective? Like what advice would you give them to be able to focus more and block out some of that noise?
So focus is such an interesting word because you can focus on negative things and you can focus on the wrong things, right? So if you focus on your failures, then that's all you're going to see. And if you focus on where you've succeeded and where you've shown that you can learn something or do something, then that's what you'll experience. I also laughed a little bit from myself when you said focus. I sound so focused. I actually really have always loved keeping my options open as just my personality type. I always want to be able to bob and weave and say, if I can't do this, then I'll do this. And if I can't do this, then I'll do this. So to me, knowing that failure is information, that a mistake or an error is information of, oh, it didn't work that way. So I'll try another way. So to me, the focus is not on the immediate, it's on the end goal and the result that you're going for, and allowing a lot of flexibility in how you're achieving it. If that makes sense of the difference between focusing on the result versus focusing on the obstacle that you're staring down.
So the failure is information. Is that to build out better processes based on that failure?
Yeah, I mean, if processes and or flexibility. So I'm a big believer in agile, and whether you're applying agile to software development, since I'm currently running a software company, but also in terms of learning development and business, being able to say. Uh, just one way. There's not only one way to achieve something, right?
Sure.
And my dad could tell you that you can type 35 words a minute whether you've got 10 fingers or not.
Sure.
So when you think about a challenge, I can't even say it as an obstacle or an error. I like, it's a challenge. Great, bring it on. How do I get over around this obstacle? And by the way, that also differentiates you from your competition, because if they're staring at the obstacle, they're not looking at the way around it.
What if the failure has some pretty intense consequences?
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so someone is thinking about investing in a certain project in their company, and they could go forward with the project, and it's like a toss up. Like if it works out, it's going to be amazing. It's going to bring in tons of revenue for the company. But if it doesn't work out, they're on the hook for a ton of just investments they shouldn't have been doing. So now it's going to potentially blow up in their face. It's going to cause all kinds of mayhem. They might have to lay people off based on them putting this project forth. So if the
Right.
failure has a ton of potential negative consequences,
Consequences. Yeah.
how do
Great.
you,
Wonderful.
yeah, how do you view that as information? I mean, I
I
guess you
love
still
that
would, but it
question.
would be on a higher level, right?
Absolutely. So consequences are real, and I actually love the fact that the world has real life consequences. And understanding what those are and using the information about real world consequences gives us advice and guidance on contingency planning and what are the best options to do with our investments, with our time, with our money, with our resources. I liken it back to, again, my upbringing. I also raised my kids this way. Pain is information. Right. So when you starting to experience pain, you might decide to work through it, or you might decide, hey, I need to back off a little bit and find out where this is coming from. It's not always, oh, ye gods, call, the emergency room. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. But we're not going to make good decisions if we are either blindly thinking everything is fine, I'm going to ignore pain or all information that's to the negative. But I also am not going to succeed if I think every little bump and bruise is something that tells me I should stop, because then I'm always in the practice of stopping. So to me, if you're in a neutral situation where the benefits and the consequences are neutral, that's a no. Right? Because to me, I work with, and you mentioned the book 10X Leader is all about 10X interventions where you have an intervention that allows you 10X results. The margin of error can be pretty wide when you're getting 10X results. If you're only doing break even, there's something wrong with your strategy. When we're doing business, when we're making changes in the world, all the effort that we put into it, there's a certain amount that we're not calculating into that ROI calculation. So you want to go over the estimate. I mean, imagine the popcorn bowl full of bills. You don't want to say, hey, I'm going to make just enough money to pay off those bills. Same in business. I'm not going to make just enough money to cover my costs. Of course not. There's going to
Sure.
be unexpected costs, unexpected interferences. And so you need to really go above a certain bar. And I'm talking more than IRR, right? I'm talking more than the internal rate of return of a given project. You want to exceed that. And that's how you really get extraordinary results, is by going further past the bar. So if you've got a neutral position, a neutral situation, then you need to trade up.
Sure, sure. All right, so let's dive into the 10x leader piece, because I'm sure there's people listening thinking to themselves like they can't even fathom 10xing their leadership ability. So let's just start with doubling. Let's start with doubling.
Sure.
If someone wanted to double or triple or quadruple or whatever the case may be, if they wanted to radically expand their ability to be a leader, what would be a couple things that you would say you need to set the groundwork here? This needs to be the solid foundation before it could be built. What would some of those things be?
Yeah, I would say the main issue is the diagnosis of the situation you're in. The 10X Leader method talks about diagnosis, linking your interventions to your business results, and then multiplying the impact through leverage. So it's diagnosis, linking, and leverage. And it's based off of these three errors that people make because they miss this. When people misdiagnose, they go, you know what we really need? And they think that what they need is something that is exciting or new or interesting, but they actually don't diagnose the business problems, either in their market, in how they're operating, in their teams. And because they fail to pause and diagnose, they're not getting impact from their leadership. They're just stepping in and saying, here's what we really ought to want to have, or here's what we should do. And that may be based on past experience. It may be based on looking what somebody else did and saying, oh, we should mimic that, without recognizing the real situational factors and data associated with your real business, your real market, your real customers, your real products. So diagnosis, I think, is really the first step in saying, what is the biggest impact we could make? What's the biggest either problem we could resolve or opportunity we could take advantage of? And that's a basic SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then determining an intervention that's going to fix that one thing. And that one thing usually has a people component to it, which I'm a huge advocate of as a learning professional, which is to say that who needs to learn what to fix that problem or to take advantage of that opportunity. And that can give people extraordinary results.
So the first was diagnose the situation you're in. The second you said was determine the intervention.
The linkages, the links between what you're trying to fix and the business results you're going to get out of it. You need to link it to your KPIs and your measures for actual results.
Okay, so determine the links. And then you mentioned a third one about leverage.
Leverage.
Right? Leverage.
Yeah.
Okay. What does leverage mean to you? I think sometimes there's different pictures that pop up in people's mind when they think of that word leverage. So what's the picture that comes to your mind?
So I like to think of all the things you did as a toddler when you weren't very strong and you had to move things. You had to figure out leverage, whether it was the seesaw on the playground or whether it was, I need to push this box because it's in my way. If you're small, you need to figure out how to move it. You might use a different angle. You might use tools like wheels. You might be able to get some assistance, right? So any kind of leverage, I like to look at the people leverage. So when you have customers, you can engage customers to leverage your launches or your products or your insights on how you're adding value. You could leverage your partners across reseller agreements or value-added resellers. You could leverage your vendors. Maybe your vendors could be providing more for you in ways that you weren't taking advantage of. You can leverage the structure of your organization. So if you have departments or teams that are not integrated and they're in silos, that they may you have the opportunity to leverage one intervention. Let's say you were fixing, I don't know, accounts receivable. And that's the responsibility of the finance team, and particularly the AR team. If you leave it there, you don't get any leverage. On the other hand, if you say for the next 30 days, AR is everybody's problem. You teach everyone about the leverage with accounts receivable. And then you discover that the number one reason why people are not paying their bill is because they have a customer service issue. Now AR becomes customer service and project management's issue, right? We know this as facts, but it's leverage if we say everybody's job is fixing the cash flow, getting some AR in. The project managers or the customer service people resolve those issues that are preventing accounts receivable from happening. We teach them the skill of asking for the payment. Are you happy with our service? Yes, I am. How can we expedite your payment? And then hand it over to accounts receivable. We've created a team opportunity, but we've also created a leverage across multiple departments in our organization.
I love that. I love that. All right. So I have to give you a picture because as you're speaking, this picture's come to my mind. And I think that there's definitely a correlation when it comes to business. So I wrestled for 10 years. I was a big part of my life, a lot of matches. And there was a kid on my high school wrestling team that was ranked second in the country. Okay. So second in the country. He's one of the best wrestlers in the United States of America. He barely had any muscle on him. Okay, so if you would see an image of this guy, what's that?
And you're thinking, how?
Exactly. So if you would see an image of this guy, you would think how on earth is this person a wrestler, let alone one of the best in the country? He was dominant. I mean, half the matches would forfeit on him because they realized they were going to be put through tremendous pain if they had to wrestle him. What he would do is he would use other people's leverage against them. So if you were
Hmm.
extremely strong, he would use your strength against you. And it really spoke to his element of creativity on how he
Hmm.
was able to use his body to pin as many people as he did. Now, why I say that is because as you're speaking to me, it almost paints this like David and Goliath type story where if someone is running a department and maybe they have a lack of resources, or maybe their team is way smaller than their competitors, or whatever the case may be, they need to use leverage to be creative, to not only think outside the box, but do outside the box, right? Doing is the action to really
Exactly.
lead them to those results. So, how do you think creativity really ties together with that leverage piece?
I think one of the things that came to mind for me was business acumen as well, which may be a bit of an overused phrase, but I do think that people need to understand exactly how value gets added to customers, how processes get enacted. You mentioned process earlier when we were speaking. And the higher up one goes in an organization, by the way, the less you understand how things actually get done in your organization. So it's important to recognize this as executives and leaders that we probably have a very shallow view of what it really takes to get things done in the organization. And so some patience and also humility and listening is important when we figure out, okay, why is this happening and how could something be fixed, is really digging into how that value is getting added, how those processors are being deployed so that we can improve or release them. I imagine that this wrestler knew a lot about his own body and how much he could pull on one thing versus another and how it was all connected. So, very self aware, and where he could put himself in terms of leverage according to the other individual in the ring. So, when we consider putting in some leverage, we have to understand all the angles, how much strength we have and how much strength we don't have in each of these areas. So I do think it takes creativity, but it takes creativity of looking at all those options, doing all that contingency or scenario planning for all of the options, picking a not necessarily the best, but maybe a good route to try in an agile way to say, will this work? If we change this, will this work? And I do believe in empowering the people in the organization to come up with some of those ideas because they know more about how the work gets done than most of us in leadership positions do.
So you mentioned a really important piece that I don't want people to miss. And it's as you continue to build out your leadership, you're going to be in different situations, different positions. And now a lot of what you might have worked on in the past, you're not working on anymore. And some people may think to themselves, oh, you're great at delegating, like not just you, but anyone, you're great at
Sure.
delegating. And that's awesome, right? That's a very desirable skill to be able to put the right people in the right seats, but then they could potentially lose sight of what's happening, like how things are actually made, how processes are actually carried out. So, what would be a strategy that you would recommend people could do to not lose sight of some of the things that they should be at least aware of? Yes, they're still delegating, but they still need to be aware of something. Can you think of a strategy or maybe setting up learning tours, or what would that look like to you in an organization?
Oh, I'm so going to patent learning tour now, Matt.
There
Thank
you
you.
go.
I do believe in that. I also think that leaders need to stay close to the customer, right? Have opportunities to do skip levels where they chat and have roundtables or conversations with individuals at multiple levels in the organization. Just ask how are things going, give people a voice. It's a distinct human need to be able to be heard and seen, right? And that creates a great deal of engagement. And I also think that recognizing that empowering people takes some trust. So, yes, I do think you should ask a lot of questions in a gentle way, not in a check up kind of way, but in a check in kind of way. I'm not checking up on you, I'm just checking in. How are things going? What could be better? Anything I can help with? That's the support portion of delegation. If somebody says they're a good delegator and they believe in seagull management, which is, flying over, dumping on somebody and flying off again, that's not delegation. Delegation also requires the equivalent amount of support, which is how can I get you what you need in order to accomplish these goals? Because we're a team together and I can get you the resources to help make that happen.
Sure.
So that to me, I think is part of the whole picture. I do love having the opportunity to talk to customers, to be on the ground, observe in whichever way you can. It doesn't happen very often, maybe only on the show Undercover Boss, but I do think every once in a while, CEOs, presidents, vice presidents should sit in on some support calls. Just listen in, get to hear what it's like. One of my favorite habits that I heard a CEO have was that he read every single exit interview. It was his commitment. Every time somebody exited the company, they would do their exit interview with HR. It would get recorded. Of course, we didn't know who it was, but he would read every single one so that he understood and kept pace and kept a finger on the pulse of how the employees were feeling in the organization for real, because people say the truth when they're on their way out.
Well, and for people that say they have a vibrant company culture, what better way to understand how vibrant that culture is by seeing why people would want to leave that
Why did they
culture,
leave?
right?
Yeah, and there are
Exactly.
good reasons, right? But there's some honesty and insights that you can get, certainly. Hopefully
Sure.
before then. That's a trailing indicator, of course.
Sure. So you mentioned habits, right? The importance of habits. So clearly the CEO that you mentioned, reading different exit interview pieces, that's a good habit that's going to yield hopefully positive results if different things are changed based on the information that individual's getting. So how would you inspire leaders to think about habits, and how do you coach someone when it comes to blind spots, right? And here's what I mean by this. We all know we need good habits, right? Like if we want good things to happen, we need good habits. But what about the blind spots on habits we don't even know we need? How does someone go about finding those out?
Sure, there's so much there, Matt. I believe the number one attribute or skill that a leader can have is self-awareness and continuously developing that 360 view of how their leadership is being experienced. And that is all about blind spots. Now, we've been doing a lot of work at learn.net around habits, and it's been very interesting to discover that the modern leader is so unbelievably distracted that it has changed the way we learn. We can't even focus for long periods of time anymore. So the ability to sit down in some multi-day leadership course and all of a sudden change our leadership style is actually waning. Our ability to do that, and it's partly our brain makeup, it's partly the number of distractions, and it's partly how busy we all are. So focus is in short supply. And when we think about what habits a leader needs, the first one I would recommend, which I always have done, it has to do with that comment about leaders going up into the organization and knowing less about how work gets done. There's another thing that happens as you move up in an organization. It's that you are less likely to receive training. All of a sudden we think we know what we need to know. I'm good. Right? I've gotten to the point where I wanted to get to. So we really give up on continuous learning. And that, I believe, is an error. The way to overcome that is two pieces. The first is the 360 view and asking people how they're experiencing your leadership. But the other is having a learning plan. We expect every person in our organization at learn.net, and we recommend other people do. And as I was a chief learning officer for several different organizations, we wanted everyone to have a learning plan. We would give them structures and recommendations based on their career, but every individual is different. And so based on what they want, but also what the business needs, we would make recommendations, and it was up to them to drive their learning. So I believe that each leader should have their own learning plan. When I became CEO of learn.net, I sat down and said, what do I need to build? What do I need to know? What should I develop? And created a plan for myself because there wasn't anyone around to do that for me. To me, that's the number one habit. And then from there, recognize that learning is not watching something or reading something. That's consuming. So we now have these bad habits of watching a video and saying, hey, I know how to do this, or reading a book and saying, oh, I've learned something new. Well, you've become aware of something new, but until you actually apply it, psychologists would say you haven't learned it because the psychological definition of learning is habituation. If you've moved it from the front of your brain, which is the prefrontal cortex where you have to think about it, to the back of your brain where you don't have to think about it anymore, it's become part of you, then you've really learned it. So that to me is, what do I need to habituate so I can move it to the back of my brain and focus on new skills? And that habituation of checking in with your people, getting 360 feedback, finding out what's going on with the customers, watching the P&L, watching the revenue or the margins, or what are the things that you are watching on a regular basis, and making sure that those habits are the right ones for you, and then adding or subtracting from that as appropriate.
Wow. I really like what you said, that watching or reading something is consuming. It's not actually learning, because there's a lot of
Sorry.
people out there that may be thinking that, and that could be spelling horror for them because they don't actually know how to do it. It could be very dangerous because there's so much information out there. We know a lot about a lot of different things, but we might not know how to apply it. So I really appreciate you saying that. I think there's a
Just
ton of
think about
wisdom in that.
all the things you've learned, Matt. I want to tell you one more story. I used to love to play piano when I was a kid, not because I liked the theory. I hated it. I hated the going through the scales, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, A, B, C, D, E, all of that sort of thing. But I loved playing the theme to MASH or getting to play Hill Street Blues. And it was my favorite thing. Whenever I'd walk by a piano, I'd sit down and play Hill Street Blues on the piano. It was like, wow, that sounds great. Well, I had a big birthday recently. I was walking by a piano. I sat down and I couldn't do it. I had forgotten how to do not just the left hand, which a lot of pianists will remember the melody, but not the harmony. I couldn't remember the harmony. And then I sat down, I had to pick out the melody. And I had to really reacquaint myself with that sheet of music. So even if you learned it a long time ago, those skills that you learned in school or grad school or that great training course, if you haven't reinforced it, then you've probably forgotten. And this is what we do at learn.net is we help people habituate the most important top of mind skills, because we forget, and we don't even remember what we've forgotten. You've watched that video, you've read that book, and you're not really using that skill anymore.
Sure. There are a lot of perishable skills in our life, right? Sometimes
Perishable skills, I
it's
like that.
it's not like riding a bike, right? A lot of skills are perishable. So we need to understand which ones are for sure. Public speaking is a perishable skill. So,
It
there's a
is,
lot of
isn't it?
people that it's amazing. They stop speaking for a few years and then they get back up on stage and they're like, how do I do this again?
During the pandemic, a lot of people got out of the habit, Matt.
For sure, for sure. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I mean, this interview was steeped in tons of wisdom, a lot of takeaways, but there's a few that I'm going to focus in on based on what you had mentioned, Stephanie. So the first one was pain and or failure is information. I think that is an incredible rule of thumb. I think that's a huge perspective shift, right? Because we all go through failure. How can we use it as information for fuel for success? I think that was a huge takeaway. The second was I really appreciate you mentioning and kind of breaking it down for us. Diagnose the situation you're in, determine the links, and then focus on that leverage piece. I think a lot of wisdom in that. The third piece was I appreciate you mentioning this. I never thought about it this way. There's a big difference between checking in versus checking up. Another big perspective shift. And then I also appreciate the learning plan piece. I challenge everyone listening to this to come up with a learning plan. That sounds awesome. That sounds like something people should focus on like right away. They should end this podcast and then figure out, how do we even start? Where do we go to get that learning plan in place? So those are my big takeaways. If anyone wants to contact you or they want to get more information on what you do, where's the best place they can go to get that information?
Absolutely. So they can find me on LinkedIn or certainly visit us at learn.net. We'd love to connect.
Perfect. I'll include that in the show notes. People could just click and go from there. Thank you again. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for the great conversation, Matt. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. Please leave a review, since positive reviews will make it easier for others to find this conversation. Next episode will launch on Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern. Until then, remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.